Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub analyzes grain markets. We look at the possible addition of a state beef checkoff program. Keith Glewen explains how the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network can benefit farmers. And Daryl Martin will discuss deficit irrigation. Before we get to our market analysis with Elaine Kub, we should note that you'll see Jeff Peterson asking the questions this week. Jeff is the president of Heartland Farm Partners and also a lecturer in the Ag Economics Department here at UNL. The reason for the switch is because Curtis and I are traveling to the South African 2013 World Soybean Research Conference in Durban. Held every 4 years, the theme of this year's conference is From China to Africa, Can Research Close the Gap Between Soy Production and Increasing Global Demand? Part of our traveling entourage will be Lauren Giesler, who attended the same convention 8 years ago in Brazil. He explains what we'll see in South Africa.
The main goal of that is really to exchange research information from people around the world. And so it's intended to be an international conference. It tends to bounce from the northern to the southern hemisphere, and it's really just an excellent place for people from all over any of our soybean producing countries to meet and really exchange information on what they're finding in research areas that they do. You know, maybe advances in molecular technologies as far as tool development to research a specific problem, you know, all the way to the things that most of us, or someone like myself, is more interested in, maybe an applied type research program where maybe they're looking at different technologies of application technologies for specific, you know, post-applied products, or maybe fungicide evaluations on different diseases, and maybe even diseases that we haven't seen in the United States as far as significant problems yet, but maybe a problem in the future.
Our hope is to not only bring you stories from the convention over the next few shows, but also throughout the growing season, as concerns that may have been addressed in South Africa arise in Nebraska. And now to this week's market analysis. Here's Jeff Peterson and Elaine Kub.
Elaine, we're having a chance to talk about the markets on Wednesday afternoon. It's that time of year again, and they're taking the insurance prices. What kind of numbers are we seeing out there?
Well, at this point, if you averaged all the February closes for December corn and November soybeans, you'd be at about $573 for the corn insurance guarantee and about $1301 for the soybean guarantee. And there's only, a week left in the month of February, so it's going to be pretty mathematically hard for those numbers to change very much. But those are profitable numbers. Those are a good, backstop for farmers this year, and it gives that soybean to corn ratio about 2.2 to 1.
Okay.
So at this point, that still motivates more corn acres than soybean acres.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. It's an important part of the marketing plan to have those numbers and kind of get us ready. It seems like we've had a week in here where there's been a few surprises. The soybean market has really surprised me this week.
Wow.
What do we see going on there?
Well, the story about soybeans is really, if you look back to last week when they were collapsing this about 70 cents in the course of last week, and even at the time you got the feeling that if this was any other week of the year, if it wasn't the Lunar New Year holiday for the Chinese traders, that somebody would have been stepping in there and stopping that fall.
Okay.
But I think because, in my opinion, because we didn't have the Asian business that week, it just kept on falling and the speculators kept on liquidating, perhaps looking at some of the sequestration stuff going on in the government budget.
Right.
And then then finally we get Chinese traders back this week, and it popped back up within 2 days. The first 2 trading sessions this week, we were up at least 67 cents. So, I mean, incredible volatility in these past 7 sessions.
Yeah, it has been really incredibly volatile. Now, it seems like, harvest is progressing down there. What's it like at the ports? What are you hearing? Is beans flowing out of there really well, or are they having some problems?
I heard something about a Brazilian port strike.
Yeah.
So, and I don't really know too much about that, and there still is the question about, I think it sounds like the harvest yields are going to turn out pretty well in Brazil, but there's still questions there, and certainly questions in Argentina. So I don't think at this point that we can turn entirely bearish for South American crop at this point.
So what do you think on the bean side? This move we're having now, is this something we sell, on the old and new crop, or do we just kind of sit back and wait yet?
Yeah, I have been a seller of beans for the past many months because I just don't like the risk of this really squirrely market.
Right.
And particularly in the old crop, we're right about that. This is Wednesday, and I don't know if we can make it through that $15 level. If we do make it through the $15 level, then that's a different story. But there might be resistance here, and this may be, maybe as high as the market can get before you find willing sellers. So yeah, I'm a seller of old crop soybeans, but I have not been marketing many 2013 beans yet.
Okay, well, good. I know we have some other news that's coming. USDA's got their Ag Outlook forum that's going to be starting. What are you thinking we're going to see coming out of that?
Well, the big talk for months now has been the idea of a lot larger acreage, planted acreage for corn, and I don't know, I think that USDA in these outlook meetings tends to be more conservative.
Okay.
And the other question obviously is whether they use trendline yields after these last several years of poor yields. And again, they tend to be conservative and not take too much into account, no actual survey-based data, perhaps not even too much of the drought data into their yield numbers.
Okay.
So I wonder if the market will kind of take their yield numbers with a grain of salt, given the fact that we still have a very severe or exceptional drought in the Western Corn Belt.
And what are you seeing going on in this corn market?
Again, the drought is the reason why I have still been pretty aggressive and holding off on new crop sales. Because there's I wonder if that drought is really priced into the market yet. It does not feel to me that it is. So in the sales that you make, typically you might think about selling here because you're making a profit or because seasonally this tends to be a good time of year to be making pre-harvest sales. If you do that, I think it's important to make sure that you're not selling more than you can certainly deliver to a place that you're writing a forward cash contract to, or perhaps leaving yourself some upside with an option strategy.
Yeah, that is true. Everybody's concerned about the weather. I know it's really hard to make decisions to make some sales in here. What do you think from the export side? It's been struggling on the corn side. Do you think we're going to see anything better coming down the road, or what do you think there?
No, I'm not hopeful for larger corn exports because I don't think we've got the corn to export. I think we're going to run out of the stuff here in this country, let alone shipping it out the door. So we're already importing Brazilian ethanol. I think the chances of corn imports is more likely than a chance of a higher corn export number in 2013. And that has pretty long-term implications for the market when you talk years down the road. We've effectively weaned our international customers off of our corn. They're going to other suppliers. India even is picking up a big chunk of the export market. So in future years, are they even going to need U.S. corn? Something to think about.
That's a very good point, because what's happening here is markets are changing as we're going forward. So as we think about this corn market in here, I know it's always hard to make some sales. What do you think a guy does here? Do we sit tight and wait on sales, or do we make some here? Or what do you think we should do?
Yeah, the new crop corn market has been pretty flat, and the old crop corn market too has not followed soybeans up this week. So yeah, it's hard to see them getting as much excitement from even the speculators or from the Asian export business like you mentioned. That's just kind of not there. So I'm not super bullish on that right now, but to the degree of old crop corn going into the late spring and summer, we just don't have it, and I think people are just going to have to pay for it. I think it's going to get wild, whether it gets wild as basis or it gets wild as futures. I think people are going to have some really excellent selling opportunities.
Our thanks to Jeff for filling in while we were away. Over the next month, Nebraska cattle producers will have the chance to attend meetings about a proposed state checkoff program. The current national checkoff program, established as part of the 1985 Farm Bill, assesses $1 per head on the sale of cattle, with the state retaining half. The Nebraska Beef Council administers the current program as it would with any future state checkoff, since it would be created by law. Executive Director Marie Bosshamer explains what will be covered at the meetings.
The Nebraska cattlemen put together a task force that met throughout the summer in 2012 to talk about the beef checkoff here in Nebraska. That task force was comprised of dairymen, feed yard owners, cow-calf operators, and folks from across the state to talk about the beef checkoff and how it's evolved in its 27 years that it's been in effect. As you look at inflation, what we see right now is that $1 is essentially equal to 47 cents today. And so inflation has certainly eroded the dollar, if you will. And for example, when I first started with the Beef Council back in 1996, our national advertising budget was about $16 million. Today, it's just over $8 million. And so when you look at all of the pieces of the pie that the checkoff is broken up into, whether it's advertising, retail, nutrition, food service, issues management, foreign marketing, there's so many different things that the beef checkoff is involved in. And when you're looking at a shrinking cow herd and that it's still just $1 per head, there is potentially a need to increase our resources.
There are 9 scheduled meetings to discuss the possibility of adding a state beef checkoff program. The first is next Tuesday in Columbus. The following 8 will be throughout the month of March at different locations across Nebraska. There will be presentations on the current checkoff from the Nebraska Beef Council and discussions on the future possibilities for a state checkoff with the Nebraska cattlemen, followed by a question and answer session. The goal of the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network is to provide a statewide on-farm research program that addresses critical farmer production, profitability, and natural resources questions. We spoke with Keith Glewen about the benefits of the network, but first we asked about the recent and fairly new Soybean Management Field Day research updates held at 4 locations in Nebraska.
Each year we conduct Soybean Management Field Days during the month of August, have done that since 1999, and thanks to the Nebraska Soybean Board for funding that educational program. We've touched many counties in Nebraska where soybeans are grown. Last year, 2011, as well as 2012, we planted replicated research plots encompassing 7 different topics, from cultural practices to disease management to weed management and growth enhancement products we evaluated. So another light bulb went on this past year, and it was, let's go back to those locations in the winter months and share the results and create an environment of discussion with the producers relating to those topics. And we did. We were in O'Neill, in Lexington, David City, as well as Columbus.
A rock star tour of sorts through the state.
There you go.
Any surprising results that you saw from your research?
Well, one thing that sort of caught my eye was...
and obviously this is a different year. This is kind of a unique year for Nebraska.
Yes, it was, and I'm guessing that's probably why this occurred, but our low populations, which we intended on in one of the studies, really didn't perform any worse than the higher populations or the recommended rates. But again, 2012, if you look at a bell curve of yields or years, we were way on the left side of that curve, and low humidities, a lot of solar irradiation, and that maybe had an influence on not adverse effects on yield when it came to low populations. Next year will probably be different. Let's hope it is.
Yeah, let's hope it is. Let's talk about the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network. You had some presentations in the state last week about that. Tell me, first of all, what it is for people who aren't familiar with it.
Thanks to the funding of the corn growers as well as the Corn Board, we were able to put the groups that we have in Nebraska in Extension working with on-farm research together under one umbrella entitled Nebraska On-Farm Research Network. And what we do is work with farmers to identify and to develop and implement an on-farm research protocol or comparison on their fields using their equipment with their resources.
And how can you, I'll ask you a 2-part question. How can you, 1, get involved, and then 2, how can you benefit from the research?
Let me answer the second question first. We have a saying, and that is, it's what you think you know that you really don't know that can really hurt you when it comes to production agriculture. And today's production agriculture is big money. And so if you make a decision based on wrong information, it could cost you thousands and thousands of dollars. So what we want to do is work with growers so that if they're conducting on-farm research, they're doing it correctly. They're setting it up correctly. And to divide a field in half and put treatment A on one side of the field and treatment B on the other isn't the right way to do it, because there's a lot of variability that exists in the field, from nutrients to moisture, topography, soil texture, and that can all influence yield. And so what we do is we sit down with the growers, talk about what do you feel is important in terms of profitability in your operation when it comes to growing corn and soybeans, for example, or wheat. And can we identify those topics, and can we do on-farm research to see if something is better than what you've been doing? And farmers tell us that we appreciate the research you're doing at the research and extension centers and at the university in general, but you know, my farm's unique. It's different. I have different soils, I have different equipment, whatever. And I'm always interested in taking what you are proclaiming from the laboratory to see if it'll work in my farm. So we sit down with the growers and we identify that question or that problem, and then we put together a plan on how to make those on-farm comparisons.
How have people benefited from in the past? Do you know?
Yes, we've evaluated the group over the years, and just quickly it equated to approximately $7,000 per operation. They felt the benefit was, and that was a number of years ago. So with today's economies, it's probably a lot more than that, Jeff.
Our full interview with Keith can be found on our website, and for more information on Nebraska's On-Farm Research Network, you can log on to the Crop Watch website and click on the Farm Research tab on the left side of the page. Ethan Kenny of Amherst races for fun and for ethanol. The recent University of Nebraska graduate's enthusiasm for car racing is featured in the February Nebraska Farmer. Kenny burns E10 in the race car he drives in the state's stock car circuit. Kenny says he enjoys supporting and defending ethanol to his competitors. He's been experimenting with the ethanol-fueled car since high school. You can read more about this avid racer and ethanol promoter in this month's Nebraska Farmer. While only in February, the concerns about little moisture are easy to understand based off last year's impact in fields across the state. Some irrigators, like those along the Republican River and in the Panhandle, face water allocations of acre inches per year. We recently talked with Darrell Martin about what has worked and what hasn't worked for those situations with deficit irrigation.
Deficit irrigation generally means when you don't have a large enough water supply to irrigate your entire acreage to achieve a maximum yield or an attainable yield for that field.
Why are the reasons that people either have to or want to do this?
Yeah, well, one big reason is that a large part of the western half of the state is now under a water allocation program, where the amount of water that they can pump on either a given year or over multiple years is limited by regulation. And so then they have to make a choice on how they manage that. There's a few other NRDs in the eastern part of the state who are also looking at maybe some limitations on the volume of water you could pump.
You see that moving further east, the allocation?
Well, that's certainly the way it's going. I won't predict that it's going to necessarily happen in some of the eastern NRDs, but I know some are just looking at it in some areas of the NRD this year, and other ones are starting to think about that.
Let's take a look at some of the things that people have done or people are thinking about doing to maybe maximize what they can for water. And some of them, you say they're short-term. They're short-term fixes like only planting in certain areas or switching crops completely. Why are those short-term fixes, and why might they not be the best decisions to make?
Well, a common thing that we get is people think about, instead of planting corn, they think about planting a crop that maybe requires less irrigation for the year to produce that full yield. But what we find is the productivity of corn is so high. We get so many bushels of corn per unit of what we call evapotranspiration, which is water that either evaporates or transpires. It's very, very steep for corn, which means there's a high value for the water that's used by corn. So many times it's more attractive to stress corn a little bit or some rather than planting some other crop and producing the maximum yield, because you're just not getting as much value out of the water.
What about only planting in, maybe that area, that circle that the irrigation would go, or the area that you're irrigating? Yeah,
that's another common question that we receive. People think that maybe instead of having 130 acres, maybe I'll plant 100 acres and go for maximum yield on that 100 acres. But when we analyze that, what we really find is that in a dry year, it doesn't make that much difference whether you have the 130 acres and some reduced yield versus 100 acres and a full yield. But producers also need to think about what happens in a year that turns out to be a little bit more rainfall than they thought. Then they've given up the earning potential of that 30 acres that they might have idled. And many times that lost opportunity is more significant than what the impact might have been in the dry year, actually.
What are the longer term things? What are things that the people who have been in this situation for a long time have had success doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, the things that they've done is one, they've become as efficient as they can. And frankly, I like the way we do it in the state where the NRD will set an allocation, growers know what they can pump, they get more efficient, and then maybe the NRD has to reduce that allocation to manage the watershed. But every time we do this, just the innovation of producers, we get much more efficient. We get a lot more value out of that water.
Efficient in what way?
Well, how much of the water that you pump is actually used by your crop? That's really the ultimate goal for the farmer, is to have as much water as they pump as possible to go to the crop. So reducing runoff, reducing water that percolates through the root zone, those kinds of things tend to improve the ability of that farmer to make the most value of that water.
In that sense, do you recommend things like soil water sensors or simple things like leaving crop residue on to try and trap moisture there?
Yeah, absolutely. Reduced tillage, especially the fact that we're almost 85% of the irrigated lands with center pivots today. Certainly the center pivot works very well with reduced tillage, and you take advantage of all of those factors. Monitoring soil moisture in these conditions can be helpful. Mostly what it can let them do is delay when they first irrigate in the spring a little longer than they might normally do that. And they might be able to catch a rain then in the spring that they wouldn't have had to put the water on. And so the reason you monitor soil water in the eastern Nebraska where we don't have those allocations is to reduce the amount of water you pump. But when you're allocated how much water you have to pump, it's really when's the best time to use that water during the year.
I'll end with this. If you're trying to do it based on the ideal time to stress the crop or putting the crop through a little bit of stress and then irrigating, what are the pluses and minuses or benefits and drawbacks to that?
Yeah, what a lot of our research has shown is that you want to avoid severe stress during that tassel reproductive stage, silking period. You also have to think about how much well capacity you have. That is, how many gallons per minute your well produces per acre of land. And so if you have a well that has a really high water supply, you can maybe wait till maybe a week or two before that tasseling, a couple weeks before tasseling. If I have a smaller water supply, then I probably want to get ahead of the curve a little bit and store some water in the soil so that it can carry me through that sensitive time.
Does the same type of thing apply for pod fill and soybeans, perhaps?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
That R3, R4 stage is important in eastern Nebraska. In western Nebraska, we might need to irrigate soybeans a little bit earlier because we don't have as much rain and maybe not as much soil water carryover. So in the western half of the state, we may want to look at beans a little bit early in the year.
If you're interested in learning more about deficit irrigation, we'll post a link on the Market Journal website to a recent Crop Watch story on UNL's deficit irrigation workshop. There are also a series of no-till deficit irrigation and water optimizer workshops planned in western Nebraska next week. The dates and locations are Tuesday, the 26th in Sidney, the 27th in Alliance, and the 28th in Scottsbluff. You're encouraged to RSVP to the local county extension office. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a retrospective look at what this significant snow system that came out from the central and southwestern United States and also developed a fairly significant snowstorm across most of Nebraska. And then, of course, that system is now lifting toward the upper Great Lakes region. We did see some very heavy snowfall across the I-80 corridor. As we got into the western portion of the Panhandle, of course, precipitation totals dropped off. But this was, again, very welcome in terms of moisture. It's not going to undo the drought by any extent, but we need to see numerous types of storms of this magnitude as we progress through the next couple months to give us a semblance of hope that we can build some sufficient soil moisture recharge. The problem with this storm is that we had some pretty significant cold air move in prior to the storm, so we did, again, freeze our surfaces. So much of this snow may not make it into the profile, but we still have to have the runoff to start refilling our stock ponds and getting our hydrological situation a little bit more in balance. Now, the bad news is we do have another snowstorm that is potentially taking aim at Nebraska as we get into late Sunday and then carrying on all the way through Tuesday. So let's get right to the forecast and see what we might expect as we go through this next 7-day period. As we go to the upper air maps, what we are going to notice is the upper air low that was responsible for our heavy snow is now sitting over the Great Lakes. There's another piece of energy that's starting to move through the mid-Mississippi River Valley. You'll notice there's a little streak right here, and there is some energy that might be crossing eastern Nebraska. It might generate some flurry activity, but for the most part, we're looking at some fairly benign conditions as we go through today. Now, as we go into tomorrow, what we're going to notice is that storm system starts to make its way out into the Plains region, and we do expect some snowfall to start increasing in intensity across the Panhandle and the western Sandhills as we get into tomorrow afternoon and evening, and then that will translate itself eastward across the state. So by the time we get to Monday, we're looking at the storm system starting to wrap itself up across eastern Nebraska, and this is very concerning because the models do keep this in place all the way through Tuesday. So this may not be a real heavy snow for a short burst of time, but a prolonged snow event that could last all the way into Tuesday as the storm slowly makes its way to the Great Lakes region. Yet another system is coming through the southern stream. Now, right now it's keeping it just south of Nebraska, but if this lifts a little bit farther northward, we could be looking at an additional piece of snow that will start to generate activity across Nebraska, particularly in the Wednesday-Thursday time frame, but I'm thinking it's going to stay south of us. So it would not surprise me by the time this is all said and done with it, we'll have locations in the state that will have a good 2 foot of snow on the ground. And that means it's going to hold temperatures back for a considerable amount of time, and we're not going to see the rapid warm-up that we did last spring. Now, the time we get to Thursday, we'll start to see that low transitioning toward the Great Lakes. You'll see ridging starting to build in, and as we get into Friday, that ridge starts to be ever closer, so we will see a definite warming trend. So let's take a look at the numbers. If we look at the numbers, we're going to be looking at primarily temperatures that are going to be well below normal, heavy snow starting to move in the state, particularly on the Monday time frame, be exiting out eastern Nebraska sometime Tuesday, and then we get a general clearing trend as we go toward the end of the week, and we'll start to see temperatures moderating back toward more normal conditions. In terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, that cold air is going to shift to the east. With that ridge building into the west, we'll see warmer temperatures, and of course with that ridge and no precipitation, we would expect below normal precipitation.
Thanks, Al. Our interviews with Elaine Kub, Keith Glewen, and Daryl Martin are archived as part of the February 22nd episode on the Market Journal website. Next week, we'll report from the recent Women in Agriculture Conference, and we'll show you the first part of our reporting from South Africa and the World Soybean Research Conference. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The Soybean Checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.